go. Great. Perfect.
Okay, great. It's so nice to be with all of you, and it is particularly so nice to be among such incredible wisdom and company. Meredith and G and Dr. Bernstein, thank you so much for all that you have shared today with everyone. I know I always learn when I get to be part of these sessions. So I'd like to start by just asking how many of you feel that what or how you eat impacts your migraines? And you can just think about this. You can throw it in the chat if you want to. How many of you feel that food impacts either the severity or the frequency of your migraines? And then how many of you find that your migraine attacks impact your food choices, either before, during, or after? So this is kind of on the other end, right? Like what you're eating, the food choices that you're making change depending on how you're feeling and where you are in terms of your migraine cycle. So eating is complicated, and it is undeniable that changing eating habits can have a profound impact on the frequency and severity of migraine disorders. And it's also true that this relationship is not one that we can avoid altogether. So we can't just break up with food and go a different direction, right? It's part of our daily life. And so learning to find that peace and that balance for each of us, no matter sort of depending on how that looks for you, is really important. And I'm hoping that I can give you some helpful tips for that today. So there's little doubt that what we eat, I'm just gonna minimize myself here. Okay. What we eat impacts our physical and mental health and can impact the severity, frequency, and duration of migraines. I know that not all migraines involve headaches, so we'll broaden the category. And food is rarely the only factor influencing migraines, which are complex and multivariate, as we've seen today, and as I'm sure all of you experience in your own bodies and lives. So I really like to think about this bucket analogy when I'm working with people. And maybe some of you are familiar with this, and if you're not, I'll just talk through it really quickly. So we think about the bucket as your threshold for migraine, right? And when it overflows, that's when symptoms start. And some of the things on this list we can control, right? We have some control over the food that we eat, whether or not we consume alcohol, how much we're sleeping, our hydration. And some of the things we absolutely can't control. So if you're a person who menstruates, you can't control your hormones. And for many people, the hormones are a huge trigger, and it can be a big enough trigger to fill your entire bucket, right? We can't always control pressure changes, bright lights and sounds, smells that are triggering. So some things are out of our control, and then some things we can try to have an impact on. They're a little bit more modifiable by us. And then at the bottom, you can see this sort of foundational piece where we're really creating more capacity in the bucket. So these are these things that G and Meredith and Dr. Bernstein have talked about, right? Self-care, mindfulness, what's happening in your body, hydration, sleep, maybe supplements and medications go in this part of the bucket analogy, because a really good preventative is going to give you a lot of extra capacity in your bucket, right? Movement, sleep. So you can also see, if we're thinking in this analogy, that for something, and I would put food often in this category, that may not be big enough to fill your entire bucket, sometimes something will trigger a migraine, and other times it may not trigger a migraine. So if you have 3 or 4 factors stacked, you might overflow, whereas another day you might get away with eating something that may be adding a little bit to your bucket. So I sort of think about these 2 main strategies that we can use to help to modify or manage migraine through diet and lifestyle. So we can increase our thresholds by focusing on, as Dr. Bernstein likes to point out, keeping the body in homeostasis, right? Regularly attending to self-care and nourishment practices that help keep our body, brain, and blood sugar levels balanced. And we're going to talk about that last piece a lot today. And then we can talk about decreasing triggers from sources that we can control. So we can both work on limiting what goes into the bucket, and we can also work on really turning on those spigots to give ourselves extra capacity. I want to say that not all people with migraine will find triggers in the foods they eat, but everyone can benefit from making healthier food choices. So where I recommend starting for most people is this baseline piece, right? The creating more resilience piece, where we're talking about following an anti-inflammatory, low glycemic, mostly whole food based diet. And we're going to talk a little bit more detail about what I mean. When you do this, when we start here, you have a much better baseline to be able to discern whether you may then be having some specific triggers that could be pushing you over the edge. When everything is all over the place and out of whack, it's much more difficult to assess in a reasonable way whether you actually have triggers that are then adding into that bucket load. So the second strategy could be, once we kind of get the first piece settled, an elimination diet targeted at reducing common food triggers. So the goal of this would be to identify and reduce triggers, so we're filling the bucket less quickly. And for those who have significant triggers, this can be game changing, right? If you can identify some of those and take them out of your diet, I mean, people see huge results. But not everyone has significant food triggers. And the diet itself can cause a ton of stress, also a trigger, right? So this is why I sort of don't put the cart before the horse in my work with people by and large. I also want to point out that elimination diets are not appropriate for all people. So anyone with a history of disordered eating or restricted eating, this can just open up a whole world of trouble. So we're going to start with the baseline. So what does an anti-inflammatory diet look like? This is really the question of the moment. And I've given a 2-hour presentation just on this. So we're going to go through it briefly, but there's no one single definition of an anti-inflammatory diet. So there's no one diet to rule them all. But what anti-inflammatory diet patterns have in common is that they're rich in colorful fruits and vegetables, which makes them high in phytonutrients and antioxidants. And these are both actively anti-inflammatory themselves and also feeders of our microbiome, all the gut bugs that live inside us, which also have a huge role to play in the inflammation process and in brain health. They're high in fiber. They're high in healthy fats. So what do I mean by healthy fats? So these are going to be omega-3 fatty acids that you can find in fish or in the algae that the fish eat. You can find it in flax and chia, hemp seeds. We'll look at some of those specifically later in the talk. Dark leafy greens, and then monounsaturated fats from sources like avocado, high quality olive oil, nuts, and seeds. We're looking for high quality plant and or animal proteins. We're including anti-inflammatory herbs and spices like ginger and turmeric. And we are going to talk about a low glycemic diet, which essentially means a diet that's going to help keep our blood sugar levels really balanced throughout the day. And we're going to go into that in a lot more detail. So here's one example of an anti-inflammatory diet pyramid. This is published by an organization called Old Ways. And the one thing I would say about this is that wine, not always the best idea for people with migraines, right? There are a lot of things in there that can be triggering. So we'll put that to the side despite its phytonutrient content. But the rest of it, you see this baseline of connecting, being mindful, being active. And then right above that, you see all these colorful plants, right? Like that's really the base of this diet. And then above that, fish and seafood for some more healthy fats and healthy proteins. If you eat those, it's also possible to have a healthy vegetarian anti-inflammatory diet. Above that, we have our animal foods. And then at the very top, we have meats and sweets, right? They're not invisible, but they're eaten in smaller quantities and they're at the very top of this pyramid. I also really love the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate. This to me feels a little bit more actionable. Like I can picture my plate when I look at this, but essentially the same thing is represented. 3/4 of that plate is plant food, right? Whole grains or healthy starchy vegetables, tons of colorful vegetables, some fruit. We also have our healthy oils or fats represented there. So that could be our nuts and seeds, our avocado, our olive oil. And then we have our healthy protein. And that again could be animal or vegetable, right? So we could have tofu, or we could have fish, or we could have, a high quality source of even some red meat. So as you can probably tell, my focus is on eating a rainbow. So really upping that intake of colorful fruits and vegetables is correlated with decreased risk of you name it, right? So it's going to impact migraine and also all of these other lifestyle factors. Vegetables, fruits, beans, nuts, they're high in fiber and phytonutrients. So we're killing multiple birds with one stone here. And when we fill up our plates with these foods, we're naturally crowding out the less healthful stuff. I will also say as a side note that the more we consume foods in their whole form, the more we also are going to reduce a lot of things that end up being migraine triggers for people that show up in processed foods. So the more you're sort of throwing together a soup or a salad or eating a whole piece of fruit, you're also not eating as many things with labels and with long ingredient lists. And those can tend to be the trickier things for a lot of people anyway. So asking things like, where can I add color to my diet? So breakfast is often the first place that I'll intervene with people. And we're not gonna make a smoothie today, but in a lot of my workshops, we'll make a smoothie where we sneak in either a handful of spinach or kale, or we'll do some frozen riced cauliflower, which if you haven't experimented with, you can sneak that right into a smoothie. You don't taste it, you don't see it, but you have a full serving of vegetables first thing in the morning. So this is often a place where we're not filling our plate with color because traditional breakfast foods just aren't that colorful. But where if we can add some color in every day, we can really make a big impact. Asking what vegetables you love, right? And if you're not a vegetable lover, then asking what vegetables do I tolerate and how can I get more of those in? And maybe you toddler yourself, as I call it. So maybe you are someone who needs to sneak things in where you don't see or taste them that much, right? You're blending something in with your pasta sauce, you're putting it in a smoothie, you're adding it to a soup. So sneaking things in, it doesn't necessarily have to look like a plate of broccoli, right? If you're not a broccoli lover. And then am I including those healthy fats in my meals and snacks? So I personally am from the snack wells generation. So it was all about that low fat life. And that can be a difficult paradigm to shift out of for a lot of people. So really thinking like, where are those healthy fats represented on my plate? They don't have to be in huge quantities. Fats are actually very nutrient dense. So, a little handful of seeds or nuts can do it. A tablespoon of nut or seed butter, a third of an avocado. It doesn't have to be a massive amount. And we're thinking about progress, not perfection here. So just as there is no one anti-inflammatory diet or one diet style that everyone needs to follow, you also don't need to follow one thing 100% of the time. And I think this is like particularly important to think about when you suffer from migraines, is that just inherently you are going to have these cycles probably where you're able to be more attentive to getting in all of these great things into your diet. And then other times that feel very much less in your control, right? You don't feel well, you're nauseous, or you have certain cravings that are associated either with your prodrome or coming out of a migraine. And so having some grace and gentleness with those and knowing that this does not need to be 100%. We're just trying to make a couple of steps in the right direction. Now we're going to talk a little bit about blood sugar levels. So this is a big topic and a really impactful one. So when we looked at a randomized control trial of 350 migraineurs, And they put half of them on this high fiber, low glycemic index diet, and the other half on kind of standard medications. After a month, the frequency of migraines was reduced in both the diet and the pharmacological group, right? So that's big news. These went head to head against drugs, and the low glycemic diet was pretty effective. And then after 3 months, both groups saw a reduction in the severity. So we saw reduction in both frequency and severity. Now, I do want to point out that this also brings up the point that with diet and lifestyle change, you need to hang in there. It's not necessarily going to be something that you feel the next day, right? Or in a week. Sometimes with supplementation and with diet change, it's going to take 3 months, right? You feel a little bit better. Oops, I just lost my earpod. You feel a little bit better at that 1 month mark. And then you feel a lot better at that 3 month mark. And maybe you feel even better still if you sustain it to 6 months or a year, right? So really figuring out what these habits are that you can maintain over time. Let's talk about what I even mean when I'm talking about sort of blood sugar balance and carbohydrates and all of these things. So all carbohydrates are going to turn into glucose or blood sugar, right? Glucose in the blood. This is the predominant fuel for our brain, our muscles, and energy production in the body. If we have a little too much, it gets stored in the liver. And then if we have way too much, it gets stored as fat. Carbohydrates can be broken down into, these are my categories, these aren't sort of technical terms, but slow carbohydrates are going to be unprocessed or minimally processed, and they're going to take the body longer to do that conversion into blood sugar. Fast carbohydrates like white bread, bagels, sodas, desserts, they're going to go quickly. Your body really quickly is going to liberate that sugar and send it into the bloodstream. So glucose is your body's fuel. It is the energy, like the gas for all of your cells and your brain. And we really require a steady supply of this at all times. Big fluctuations in blood sugar levels affect the brain more than any other organ and can lead to headaches. I will sidebar this just because I know somebody on the Zoom call is thinking, what about ketogenic diets, right? So I'm going to sidebar this by saying that our body does have a backup mechanism to fuel the brain. So in the absence of carbohydrates, our liver can make something called ketone bodies, and those can fuel the brain. It really is a backup mechanism. That's not to say that it can't be effective, and it is being studied in migraine, but for most of us, most of the time, glucose is the thing, and that's what the brain is sort of calling out for. So here's this cycle. I'm showing you sort of what happens in a typical day if we look at kind of the red line, right? We start our morning at Dunkin'. Okay, we have coffee or whatever, and I can tell you because I've looked it up recently for someone, a lot of people's coffees at Dunkin's have 46 grams of sugar, let's just say, right? And we grab a bagel, and that's going to send our blood sugar level up really fast. And then when it goes up really fast, it goes down really fast. And where you see that sort of hangry line at the top and the bottom, that's where we're the least resilient and where we're the most likely to be vulnerable to a migraine. And so what we really want is that nice, even, kind of slow level and in control, right? And so we're going to talk about how to keep ourselves there. And I bet, I mean, you can tell me when we take questions, but I bet I'm not the only one who's found myself in that hangry period, right, in my day, and maybe even sometimes for big periods of my life, I would have certain times of day where I feel that way. So this is just a little, a little cartoon, but suffice it to say, the low blood sugar, the first thing on his list is headache, right? So that is really puts you in this vulnerable place. So how do we get balanced blood sugar? So the first trick is going to be to swap those fast carbs for slower ones. Again, I'm not saying this has to happen 100% of the time, but the more in your kind of 80%, in your case, say Monday through Friday, you can find substitutes that you like that are closer to a whole grain. So if you're doing a white bagel, maybe you're swapping to a whole grain bagel or 100% whole grain bread. If you're already doing the whole grain bread, that's amazing. Maybe you experiment with eating the actual whole grain. So like a wheat berry. I know it's revolutionary, but the farther that we get along the spectrum, the more result we're going to see. So our fast carbs on the left and our slow carbs on the right, you can see that these are all carbohydrates, right? They're all ultimately going to turn into that glucose in the blood, but they're going to do it at very different rates because the slow carbs are more complex, they're harder for the body to break down, and they include fiber. The second thing we can do is we can combine our carbs with protein and healthy fats. So honestly, I put the whole grain bread in because we're working on like upgrading our 80% here, right? But even if that was your bagel, combining it with an egg or nut butter or some avocado would change the blood sugar response that you have or the glycemic load of that meal. So better together. So we need those carbohydrates. Ideally, we choose them in a high fiber form. Protein is going to give you staying power. It also is going to take a little bit longer to digest. And those healthy fats are going to keep you full longer and are going to be digested more slowly. And when you add all these up, the body gets really busy and it's harder for it to release the glucose from the carbohydrates. A little trick here also, just like a little strategy, is what you eat first actually matters. So if your first few bites of a meal are anything other than the carbohydrate source. So if you start with a side salad, or you start with a few bites of your vegetables, or whatever your protein or healthy fat is, your blood sugar rise is going to be lower, even if you end up eating the same amount and the same type of carbohydrates. So let's say you still have your mashed potatoes, or you still have your pasta, but you started with a side salad, it's going to look totally different at the end of the day. So our third strategy is eat regularly and snack strategically. So I love to have people do a little energy audit. And this can also be really great, particularly if you're someone who, and some of my patients are like this, who are, like always get a headache at 3 p.m., right? Or like there's this time of the day when they're feeling more vulnerable. So track for you what that looks like, and then you plan a snack for 10 or 20 minutes before that energy drop or headache or whatever the case may be for you usually hits. This puts you kind of in the driver's seat because you can really be planful about what kind of snack that is. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that should look. Once you're in that energy slump or that hangry place, sometimes that actually can be associated with nausea and other things, or with intense cravings for something fast that's going to like break down in your bloodstream and turn into sugar. So here are some examples of these little snack combos. I have my healthy carbs and fiber on one side, my protein and healthy fats on the other. So really looking to marry these two. And then some things are already packaged really nicely. So any bean or lentil or edamame that you eat already has carbs and protein. So those are awesome, and fiber. So you don't have to do a lot of combining there. So our strategies are, we're choosing slower carbs. We're combining those with protein and fat to lower our glycemic load. We're looking at our eating pattern. We're increasing fiber overall, so looking for good sources of that. Starting your day with protein, we didn't talk about, but is a great strategy and will set up your whole day differently. So that kind of sets your kind of like blood sugar mechanism for the day to start your day with some protein, and then save your sweets for the end of the meal. We are now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We're going to try this. And then I'm probably going to cut my own head off, so I apologize for that. But we're going to make a little quick, some power balls, which are one of my favorite quick, balanced energy snacks. And this is recorded, and in the slide deck, there's the recipe for this. So you'll have it. So don't worry about writing it down. But what I'm starting with is about 3/4 of a cup of some kind of oats or quinoa flakes or something like that. What I'm actually using today, so this can be rolled oats, I'm actually using like a Trader Joe's instant oatmeal blend that's gluten-free and has some quinoa and flax seeds and chia seeds and other things. That's what I had in the kitchen. So that's what I'm going to use. Then I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of chia seeds or ground flax seeds. Remember I talked about those good fiber and also anti-inflammatory fats, and those have both of those. I'm also going to add 3 tablespoons of hemp seeds. So this is just, if anyone hasn't seen, I'm not repping the Whole Foods brand by any stretch. You can get these at Trader Joe's and lots of places, but this is kind of what this looks like. Hulled hemp seeds. These are a really great source of those good omega-3s and also of protein. So 3 tablespoons of hemp seeds has about 10 grams of protein that we're adding by putting those in. You can also swap that out for pumpkin seeds or sunflower seeds or whatever you have in your kitchen that works for you. We're going to add 2/3 of a cup of nut or seed butter. Okay. So again, this is going to be to your taste, and also some people avoid peanuts or other things, but I would say like almond butter is great. Today I'm using sunflower butter, which is school safe also for those who have kiddos with allergies. Peanut butter is also delicious. Anything ground up into a butter is going to work here. We're going to add a little bit, like 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla extract, just for flavor. I'm going to add a couple tablespoons of any natural sweetener. So that could be honey, maple syrup. It could be, today I used date syrup, which is just pureed dates. So that's like a real kind of whole food form of sweetener. And if you want to avoid the sweetener altogether, you can just add a little bit more nut butter to make up for the liquid. So again, this is so flexible. I'm going to add some coconut today, some just like toasted flaked coconut. And then I am going to add some little mini chocolate chips. Again, these could be left out. It could be carob chips, like it's whatever works for you. But basically, I'm just going to mix this all up together. And you can see like no special equipment required, nothing loud, really no mess. I mean, it's a 1 bowl situation. And that's kind of what it looks like. And then what I do is I have my nifty, of course, I didn't think about getting this out. So am I even going to be able to find it? Oh yes, okay, great. I will not show you the craziness of my drawer, but I have this little baller. So what I will do is just push them in, ball them up, you know, about that size. You could also use a tablespoon, and then put them on a plate and throw them in the fridge. So that it's as easy as that. And those can be so great to throw in your bag and just have a few at that 3 p.m. time period when you might be having that crash. What I also like about them is that they have a little bit of that like sweetness, especially if you tolerate chocolate and you can put some chocolate in there, or some carob or whatever. They sort of hit all the notes. And often in that afternoon time period, especially, that's when we're craving a little something, something, right? Like it's been a long day. And so instead of turning to the candy bowl or whatever's around, if you have that something that feels really satisfying, but you also know is balanced in all the ways that you want your snack to be balanced to keep you really regulated, that to me is a win-win. I'm going to stop there.
Sounds delicious. Great. And I'm going to go make those, and then I'm going to take a walk in the woods and meditate.
Yay.
After I stretch a little bit. This was so wonderful. I hope everybody enjoyed it. We did put our survey in the chat section if you guys would not mind filling it out for us. It's really important for our future events. But I seriously wanted to thank all of you. You guys did had an amazing presentation. I love how all of you basically, you know, your information fed off of each other, and it definitely was a group effort. And I thank you all so much, as well as our sponsors. It was a great afternoon, and I enjoyed being here so much. So thank you, Boston group. You were terrific.
Thank you.